This is another one in our series of meetings about the all things to do with Sheffield knives and cutlery companies. We've picked up a couple of companies recently. The last one we did was Walker and Hall. So this is the story of James Dixon, which is another of our favourites. So this is the founder, James Dixon. I suppose it is interesting, isn't it? If we go back to that time when he was around, how did you preserve your famous figures? And it wasn't a sort of quick photograph on a mobile phone. So there you've got a marble bust of the founder, James Dixon, 1776 to 1852. Dixons were one of Sheffield's most prominent companies. There was only 7 companies that employed more than sort of 500 and upwards towards 1,000 people. And certainly James Dixon was one of those. The family came from the Ecclesfield area and had been involved in the cutlery trade. And James Dixon got some early experience with a company, Constantine, Broadhead and Gurney. Now they were established in 1789 and they had some experience of working with Britannia metal. The firm actually ceased to exist in 1828, so it wasn't a long-lived firm, but later on in the history, there were other members of the Constantine family were involved as managers for the Dixons company. So while James was working for them, he developed an interest in Britannia metal, which had only been invented in 1769. And he once told a friend, "I have a thought in my mind that will make me a fortune." So Britannia metal, essentially it was imitation silver. James Dixon recognized that Britannia metal, which is made of tin, antimony, which is a naturally occurring material, and a little copper, was an ideal material for substituting for the materials that had been used for tea and coffee pots. Previously, they'd been made of expensive silver or brittle porcelain. And I suppose one of the things that does characterize James Dixon, if we just look at that collection of teapots, sadly, you can buy these teapots, probably made by James Dixon for, I would say, maybe £10 on eBay and even a bigger set. But this was something that was, really famous in James Dixon's production line. And of course, drinking tea, I suppose, was something else that was pretty famous in the lives of the British public. So the company started in 1804, 1805. Again, you hear slightly different versions of when they were formed, and they had a working capital of £200. James Dixon had a partner, Thomas Smith, and in directories in 1815, they appeared as Dixon and Smith, Silver Street. I don't know if you know where Silver Street is, but it's just off Paradise Square. 1822, Dixon and Smith were listed as manufacturers of Britannia metal goods and dealers in cutlery, and they also had a rolling mill in Green Lane. James Dixon lived in Broom Lodge. Now, Dixon took over the controlling interest and he moved to a new factory, and that new factory was Cornish Place. So there is Cornish Place, not as we know it now, but the bit in front of you is actually the river. And of course, one of the things is, why was it called Cornish Place? Well, this company was making its money from Britannia metal, and a key component of Britannia metal was tin, which actually came from Cornwall, hence the name Cornish Place. It's interesting, if you look at some other Sheffield cutlery companies, sometimes there's all sorts of names, many of them sometimes with American connections, but this was Cornish Place, spread out, very spacious, probably, on the edge of the countryside in those days. What was the condition of the river? We can only speculate. I suspect it's cleaner now than it would have been in those days. Well, so in 1824, James Dixon brought one of his sons on board, and the name of the company changed to James Dixon Sons. 1835, they became James Dixon and Sons. And these are his 3 sons. So we had William Frederick Dixon. Now he's down as being counting house. I suppose I'm reading that maybe he was the money person, the counting side of the company. But then you had James Willis Dixon, who was handling the American business in New York. And Dixons were very, very popular in America. They were perhaps, well, certainly one of Sheffield's most popular cutlers in America. We had Isaac Henry Isaac Dixon, and he was the traveller. And there was also a partner in the business who was William Fawcett, who was one of the son-in-laws of the family. The first articles made by Dixons were buckles for shoes. And it's funny, as we go through this talk, it is interesting, just almost just list, you could almost make a list of those things that were very important in the past that are no longer in usage. And one of those is certainly buckles for shoes. But, you know, obviously there was a big enough demand for that to be a significant product. And these could be made without buffing, which would have been something that would have cut out a process. Although there is a statement that says at some point later they were buffed. Beakers, you know, objects for drinking, tobacco and snuff boxes, sugar and cream receptacles. And, you know, Dixon's from early on was expanding. So in 1830, they acquired another company, the firm of Nicholson, Ashford and Cutts. But commentators were saying that in 1861, very much the core business of Dixon's was spoons, forks and knives. Steady growth for the company. So you can see 1805, just after they formed, they only had 8 products, 31 workmen, 19 boys. Look at the balance in 1810. Only 10 products, so they've not expanded the range of things very much, but 48 workmen and 45 boys. The last talk I did in Walker and Hall, they talked about employing boys and girls. Sadly, it may be the statistics didn't record the girls, but it's interesting that balance, that there were as many boys in the workforce as there were adults. And the same was also true in 1820. Steady growth there. A bit of a dip between 1820 and 1830, cut back on a bit of the product range. And by 1850, they had 26 items in the product range, 232 workers, workmen, and then 122 boys. Interesting that by 1890, they'd gone up to 700 workers. And by the turn of the century, 1906, they actually had 850 workers. And again, say they were one of those companies that probably could have claimed to have had 1,000 workers at different points in time. Well, back to James Dixon, the founder. So he was the master cutler in 1820. And again, that difference when we go back to the master cutlers around the sort of at the 1800s, they were very much cutlers. Nowadays, the master cutlers are often people who are involved in manufacturing, but not necessarily anything to do with cutlery. It says that in 1841, he retired from the company, a rich man. Yeah, I'll come back to this of the richness and the money that the Dixons took out. He bought Page Hall. So one of the things, many of the big prominent houses around Sheffield were obviously lived in by people in the cutlery company. I think Page Hall's quite interesting because, you know, if you Googled Page Hall now, as I did, you'll get lots of reports of, you know, disturbance in the area, maybe crime, maybe that sense of being a rundown area, but certainly this period, you know, the mid 1800s, Page Hall was clearly somewhere that's very prominent, and it was a estate of 450 acres and employed 20 workers. And he'd bought it from a banker who'd had it built in the 1770s. James, I suppose, you know, there's a bit of a feeling that he was somebody who'd come from sort of reasonably humble beginnings. In 1849, he bought himself a coat of arms because he wanted to be classed as a gentleman. And in 1852, he died and he's buried at St. Mary's, Ecclesfield. And there you have a picture of that, you know, Page Hall. Well, I think like many of these buildings, it had a fire at some point and was burned down. One of the things that James Dixon always stated was that he was about quality. And one of the things that he wanted to do was everything was going to be quality. And you can see here that between 1848 and 1883, at those great exhibitions in London and Paris, they were winning lots of awards. I suppose it's quite interesting. Probably the other awards were also won by Sheffield companies. So sometimes they might have been finishing second to another Sheffield company. Sometimes they might have been beating them. It was interesting that in 1848, they'd got a silver plate license, but in 1851, they were still winning prizes for Britannia wares, because silver plate very much sort of took over from materials made out of Britannia metal. But there was a bit of a suspicion in the early days about how good silver plate would be. And so say medals were still being awarded for Britannia wares, even though silver plate was on the scene and it had been invented by Elkingtons in 1840. 1820, 1860, Dixons dominated the American market. The 1860s, the Americans brought in essentially prohibitive tariffs against many products that were going to come from Sheffield. But generally, Sheffield companies didn't have a problem with that because they found themselves new markets. They found themselves new markets in the Commonwealth. You've also got mentioned there of Moscow. And as many of the big Sheffield companies did, they opened an office in London, and they probably had a showroom down in London as well. Clearly, London was a much bigger market than Sheffield. And, you know, the population of Sheffield around this time was still not that huge. From the 1850s, H.I. Dixon, one of James Dixon Sons, was running the company, and he was responsible for significant expansion of the factory. And he actually built on that side of the river that we saw that was open earlier. Interestingly, he lived at Stumpelow Hall. Stumpelow Hall is still there in Fulwood. It's a little bit tucked away. I think it's sort of, lots of the grounds have now been built on, but it's still got a very grand entrance. And you can get a sense of, you know, how big and important Stumpelow Hall was. And I guess you can imagine, you know, H.I. Dixon here getting in his carriage, going down from Stumpelow all the way down Fulwood Road and whatever other roads he chose to get to the factory, the Cornish Works. Now, one of the other sons was James Willis Dixon. And he'd been born in New York. He had been in charge, we mentioned earlier, in charge of the American business, but he was the next Dixon to take control of the business. He became one of the youngest master cutlers in 1887. He bought Hillsborough House, which is the big house that currently stands in Hillsborough Park, and he filled it with library and an art collection. Now, he was a keen footballer, and he was a member of Sheffield FC in 1859. Now, Sheffield Football Club had only been formed in 1857. So the sport was in its early stages. We've got all that background in Sheffield about the rules of football being written here. And apparently one of the earliest games that was going to take place in Sheffield was between Hallam FC and Stumpelow. And you can remember that the previous Dixon had actually lived in Stumpelow Hall. The game was actually cancelled 3 times due to bad weather. And in the end, Hallam FC was formed mainly from members of Hallam Cricket Club, which is older than the football club. So we actually got a game between Sheffield FC and Hallam FC. Now, so obviously we've got James Willis, who's got his interest in football. Well, in 1899, he sold 10-acre site north, it says they're north of the family home, Hillsborough House, to Sheffield Wednesday for £5,000 plus costs to pay for a new ground for Sheffield Wednesday Football Club, who had to leave Olive Grove. They had to leave Olive Grove because basically a railway line was being put through the pitch. One of the things they brought with them from Olive Grove is they actually brought a stand with them. And the first football match was played at Sheffield Wednesday, I understand, in 1899, and it was against Chesterfield. So I suppose we've got one of the great and the good of Sheffield, James Willis Dixon, basically having a big influence in one of the big sports grounds in Sheffield, Sheffield Wednesday. Right, so the company was booming, as were, you know, the Sheffield cutlery industry and associated products, the flatware, the hollowware, and everything else. They were booming, you know, the late 1800s. And the staple product was fancy dinner services, silver trays, and everything that went with it. One of the things that Dixons did was they tried to employ some of the leading designers of the time. And actually, that was with mixed success. Maybe people didn't want to try something that was different. And one of the most famous designers was Christopher Dresser. And he worked for Dixons for 3 years. And his designer teapots were sold for £2 each. You can see the 2 images below. Very, you know, wouldn't be out of place if you went to David Mellor in Hathersage now And it's almost as it, you know, very much Art Nouveau, Art Deco, but actually it's almost as if these designs were too far ahead of the time. And actually, I don't think they were that good in terms of sales. Interestingly, if you wanted to buy an original Christopher Dresser James Dixon teapot now, it would cost you tens of thousands of pounds. So when you're wandering around the antiques quarter, and the only thing is, I would say there's lots, these are the much copied designs, and if you search on eBay or the internet, what you'll find is actually lots and lots of reproductions of these products. One of the other things where Dixon stood out from some of the other Sheffield companies, it was probably the most prominent maker of anything to do with shooting, and all the accessories that went with it. So powder flasks, gun implements. I've got to mention dog whistles. In all my dealing with other Sheffield cutlery companies, whistles has never been a significant thing. I was just searching around the internet for things to do with James Dixon. And some of you might remember that we've had a bit of an association with a breadboard museum in London. Well, actually, there's a chap who was actually setting up a museum about whistles. And he basically says there was 4 major manufacturers of whistles in Britain, but the biggest manufacturer of whistles was, in fact, James Dixon. So maybe we need to make contact with the Whistle Museum. Hunting canteens, saddle flasks, and sandwich cases. You know, the flask you've got in front of you, it just does look, doesn't it, like a typical English hunting scene. That was just an image I found on eBay. It was, you know, it was a product that was currently for sale and typical of the time. Powder flasks, quite interesting, because I suppose whenever we see people using rifles in the past, they would have had a powder flask, but I was surprised that these were such a big element of the manufacturing of James Dixon. The one on the right is actually on display in a Western Park museum, and that was just a photograph I took. The one on the left, I think, was just something that I'd found that was just for sale for eBay. But powder flasks were a very significant item, and I think I'll mention them again later on. Something else that Dixons were really famous for were pocket flasks in all shapes and sizes. So in the James Dixon catalogue, which is 390 pages long, so I actually think this is the largest catalogue of any of the companies that I've come across, there are 10 pages of pocket flasks. There were 10 different sizes. The smallest size is actually the one you can see there on the left. That's a 1/16 of a pint, and they went up to 1 1/4 pints. If you want to buy a James Dixon flask, a larger one in good condition, then certainly you can see those on eBay for around £300. These are 2 that I've purchased, not for £300, I've got to say. I don't know, the one on the left, which is a lovely, the brown one, is something I bought, and it might have cost me, I don't know, £15 to £20. The one on the right, actually, I suspect, was actually the same amount of money. It's my son's Christmas present, but in the current crisis, obviously, he's never got anywhere near that. It was interesting. You had quite a choice for what you were going to get in these flasks. Clearly, what happens is you can lift out the glass container, possibly to see how much is in it. But the covering, you had a choice of hogskin, polished Morocco, diced Russian, crocodile, or Persian goat. So, well, again, these items in good condition are really quality items, very, very interesting. It's interesting, the last page of Dixon's catalogues, and I've through the museum, and I've got access to a few of the catalogues, it's almost as if this is something that was their pride and joy, and it's cartridge loading machines. Now, technically, I've no idea how these things work, but you can probably just see on the right-hand side that some of these, 3 of them, were cost over 600 shillings. And I'm assuming that this is around 1900 when this was done. So 600 shillings in today's money would actually be £4,500. So again, these weren't cheap items. And it is interesting, I think, of all the items that Dixons made, this was something they were particularly proud of. There's a little description in the middle of that slide. You probably can't, it's probably too small to read, but I'm just going to read it out to you, just a couple of sentences. The Climax system of loaders are the only machines offered to the trade that block automatically when the cartridge cases are loaded. They are the only machines that can be guaranteed not to cut short in working. They excel all other machines at the kinds of simplicity of adjustment for accuracy and measurement. So they were really proud of their cartridge machines. And I say it's sort of it was something that got the final place in the catalogue. One of the things about most items of Sheffield cutlery, flatware and hollowware is it does tell you who make it. Now, sometimes they are just the initials, sometimes they're marks, and in a sense, Dixons had a mixture of all these things here. So the classic James Dixon mark is the trumpet with the banner hanging underneath it. It's funny, I deal with quite a lot of cutlery, and I love turning something over, and sure enough, the James Dixon trumpet is there. I don't often notice the banner, I've got to say. It was only in 1879 that actually the trumpet and the banner was their symbol. So sometimes before then, you actually had the initials JD and S. And one of the things that is off people, as I buy and sell cutlery on eBay, sometimes you'll get things that are wrongly advertised because JD and S is also the initials of James Dixon Sons. Now, James Dixon Sons, their emblem was a desk bell, but again, there may have been a point before they had the desk bell, they just put JD and S. So JD and S, it could be James Dixon, or actually it could be James Dixon Son. So sometimes you do get that mixture. Maybe that's one of the reasons why James Dixon, in 1890, they added the word Dixon. So it's quite nice to see that whole range. And on the left-hand side, you can see that sort of sense of range of products. Sterling silver, electroplated nickel silver. I don't know what Cornish nickel silver was. It was probably just electroplated silver, but Cornish sounds a little bit better. It was probably a little bit of marketing there. Resistant nickel silver, that I suppose suggesting your products are very hard wearing. And then we had things like Stay Bright, stainless steel. I suspect a few other companies might have used the word Stay Bright, whether that was just copyrighted to Dixons, I'm not sure. And you can see that it says Firth Stay Bright. We've got the notion of no rust cutlery. Again, that was often an early description of stainless steel. And then also you've got the things that the James Dixon still did make some things out of pewter. So any of those marks could be something that you could turn over on a piece of product that's been made by James Dixon. Dixons were about quality. And one of the things that Dixons did, and again, I've not seen this in other cutlery catalogues. One is, first of all, to have, a whole page of a colour illustration. Now, this would have cost quite a bit of money. They were individually typeset, but just to print these colours would have added a significant value to the catalogue. But these are silver-mounted china coffee cups and saucers. And Dixons worked with Wedgwood, and this certainly also worked with Coalport. And again, I guess if you'd got a set of those coffee cups and saucers on your table, I think people probably would have been more impressed with the sort of porcelain and the china than they would have been by the metal mounts. But nevertheless, Dixons thought it's a reasonable product to add those two things together. If you were to go on eBay now and search James Dixon, you'd probably find there might be at least 10 pages of products. So at any one point in time, there'll be, there's hundreds of items. But again, sometimes it's a little bit surprising. You're expecting to find forks, knives and spoons and metal products, and some of these porcelain items turn up. And the only bit that's been made in metal is actually the lids. And certainly the one on the right, that looks like it's got a pewter top. Not sure about the one on the left, but it's obviously some form of jug, possibly a water jug with an opening lid. So again, one of the things that singles out Dixons is these partnerships and collaborations with some of these other providers. They had a massive range of products, and I say the catalogue runs to something like I don't want to say 290 pages. And so here you've got, you know, belt clasps. Now, I suppose in modern time, we think about nurses maybe used to have belt clasps, but again, that would have been a high item of fashion. And you've got, you know, you've got 2 or 3 different items there that are available. You've also got, it's interesting, something we forget about that was quite a big item of the Sheffield metal trades industry was the making of buttons. You know, and on the left, we've got a vest or a sleeve button, and on the right, we've got a coat button. And of course, it's on the right, it's a coat button in silver, you know, and I think that's saying it's £1.10 for a dozen. In the middle there, you've got a table bell, you know, which you would have been able to summon the servants with, or to get some attention from somebody. Might be the sort of thing that would have appeared in a shop, although again, silver mounted, that was £2.11. So that had a sort of significant price tag to it. You've got a stand there for a cricket ball. Generally, the tradition is if somebody's got a hat trick, bowled out 3 people, then they would like to mount the ball. So that was something that they made. And then in the bottom row there, you've got a plain card case, again, made of silver. That was £3, but presumably that notion you would have taken your own pack of cards to the pub or to visit in somebody's house. And then small boxes, I think, could have been used for snuff, could have actually had other purposes. And again, they're advertised as silver, and it actually mentions the weight of them. So the one on the extreme right actually weighs 4.5 ounces, and that was £2.13, whereas the one on the left was only 1.4 ounces, and that was actually only £1.05. Just going back to that notion that I mentioned earlier, you know, things that have become redundant, that notion of having a dressing table set. I know a friend of mine recently cleared a mother's house out, and she came across 2 or 3 different dressing table sets. One of them had been by Meppen and Webb, and some of these were made of, some of them had been made of solid silver. And you've got a range, you know, you've got a range of items there: a toilet bottle, a mirror. The third brush item is called a bonnet whisk, which is quite interesting. You've got a puff jar, you've got a hairbrush, you've got a brush with soft bristles, you've got a clothes brush, and you've got a tortoise shell comb. In the small print, though, it also says, following pieces are made in addition to the illustrations. So you could have also had a toilet or brush tray. You could have had a comb tray. You could have had a pin tray. You could have had a hair curling lamp. You could have had curling tongs. You could have had a hat pin box. You could have had a jewel box. You could have had a button hook. You could have had a shoe lifter. You could have had a glove stretcher, or you could have had a 10-piece manicure set. And it just brings it home again, the outstanding range of products that these companies made. And it just seems a really astounding business model. But these catalogues are actually an absolute treasure, and it's a privilege to be able to access them and have a look and actually see the range of the products that are there. Just another illustration that I think I've mentioned before. The Victorians had a bit of an obsession with sugar. It was a quality product. And again, so on this page, you could either have it's saying best electroplated Britannia metal, which is interesting, mixing that notion of silver plate and Britannia metal. But, you know, these are sugar scuttles. So these would be about 4 or 5 inches in sort of length, maybe 4 inches standing off the table. You can see that they've all got a little scoop behind them, and that notion where you wanted to put a number of scoops of sugar in your hot drinks, or maybe you wanted to scatter it on your strawberries or any other item of dessert that you were actually eating. But again, you know, if you're in the market for one of these, you had a choice, and probably you wanted to buy one that wasn't one that was the same as one that some of your neighbours would actually have had. You know, what I've done here, I've just picked a few items just to give a flavour of the range of things that are made. Clearly, you know, if we were to go through the catalogue, it would take us hours. But just interesting, just to see a, you know, a classic Sheffield pocket knife with lots and lots of different attachments. Certainly in the museum recently, we've been given some significant donations of pocket knives, and it is interesting sometimes speculating what some of the attachments are for. I've got no idea at the moment of that attachment on the left-hand side that has got that goes up vertically and then has two little bits sticking off the side. I'm not sure what that's for. Some of these often had items that were to do with smoking in them. You know, you can see the hook in there, which could have been done to helping you with your laces. You can see a saw blade there. You can see a corkscrew. You can see a couple of objects for making a hole. And it is interesting, isn't it, that why did Sheffield never manage to corner the market? You know, how is it that Swiss Army knives managed to replace Sheffield? I mean, Sheffield made millions of pen and pocket knives, and they are very collectible. And certainly, again, if you want to buy them secondhand, they've got a reasonable value. But it's interesting, that question about why the Sheffield knife didn't manage to rule the world for longer than it actually did. I've included this one because, again, it's closer to home, this for me, so I actually own this mustard pot. It's something that I bought as a job lot. I never intended to buy a mustard pot, but it was quite interesting when I got this mustard pot and I turned it upside down, and sure enough, it was from James Dixon. And I suppose as I turn it, I've got this mustard pot in front of me. As I turn it over, it says somebody scratched in B71. Then there's a number 64. Then it says James Dixon's and Sons, Sheffield. On the bottom, it's got FPBM, so the BM there is standing for Britannia Metal. And then it's got a catalogue number 426. One of the things we sometimes do in the museum is that people come to us and say, can you identify this object? And can you tell us how old it is? And can you tell us what it's sold for? And I hope that my little mustard pot would be in the catalogue and I would be able to match it up with a number. And you can see there's a couple of mustard pots that are very, very similar, but I cannot match this mustard pot and the number that's on it with the mustard pot in any of the 4 or 5 James Dixon catalogues that I've got access to. So there were things that were made that maybe never got in the catalogue, or they did still have quite a high turnover of items. I've mentioned this notion about quality, and I suppose often we see items of silver plated ware and they've got blue glass in them, and here we've got green glass, and actually, well, you don't see green glass anywhere near as often. And I suppose, again, it was just another interesting example because here we had a bit more of the catalogue that was coloured. And again, the printing of this would have been more elaborate. Top left, well, we've got an oval bonbon dish there. We've got an oval biscuit box. We've got a competier. We've got a tasse. We've got another competier. And we've got a fruit or a flower bowl. Sometimes they say saw pierced, which is describing the indentations in there. And just look at I've enlarged the sort of bonbon dish on the right, which is number 7,156 in the catalogue. And as some of you know, again, I do a talk about afternoon tea, but I was just wondering at what stage in the proceedings were bonbons actually served? Were they just there in addition? People could have eaten them anytime they like, or was it actually something that was served as part of afternoon tea or as part of your dinner? And again, certainly you had a choice there as well. You could have them in 7.5 inch variety or the 8.25 inch variety. And there was a correspondingly difference in price, but that, you know, £5 and 6p or would have been a significant amount there. I thought, because obviously this is all being done under the auspices of the knife project, I better put some knives in. So these are, it says dessert knives and forks. These are obviously just dessert knives, priced per 12 pairs. Interesting. And well, it says there's a little bit there that says pearl handles. sometimes I look at the catalogues and I look at this lovely dessert cutlery and ask myself the question, where's all this stuff gone? And actually, you know, if you ever thought you'd like to collect some Sheffield cutlery, some Sheffield knives, certainly collecting a few dessert knives would be a nice thing to do. Generally, the dinner knives are very plain. They might have the maker's mark on them, but very often we got these floral designs, again, the sort of bit arts and crafts type movement, you know, decorations of flowers and ferns and twirls, and also quite a bit of experimenting with different materials. We've got that central bit of the knife, the ferrule, the bit that's where it's joining the handle and the blade is decorative. And very occasionally we'll get a bit on the other end. There's the second one along there has got a finial on it, says, you know, silver caps. And so a whole range. You'd have had a choice. You could have had these with ivory handles. You could have had them with wooden handles. You could have had them with metal handles. Latterly, you could have had them with xylonite handles. And fruit knives were silver-plated fruit knives lasted longer than the carbon steel, the shear steel knives, because actually the silver plate didn't rust when it came into contact with the acid that was associated with fruit. I've had a bit of debate about with people on Facebook previously about the largest cutlery set we can find. Well, I think at the moment this is the one that's leading. So if anybody can find a cutlery set that's bigger than this, we'd be interested to know. But so 273 piece cutlery set. It does just, well, this begs a number of questions. How long would it take to lay the table? If you've got a 273 piece cutlery set, wouldn't you feel like you've got to use it? One of the other interesting things is this cutlery set cost £176. Now, £176 in 1900 would actually equate now, I think, to £22,816. So I doubt if many people would be inclined to go out and spend £22,000 on a cutlery set. It's interesting, of course, this was a 24 place setting. So you often get 6 place settings, 8 place settings, sometimes 12 place settings, but 24 place settings are quite rare. A few of the things that are listed, there was 12 egg spoons here. You had a set of meat carvers. You also had a separate set of game carvers. Yes, you had 12 egg spoons, you had meat carvers, you had game carvers, you had 4 knife rests, you had 4 nutcrackers, you had 1 pair of grape scissors, you had 1 asparagus helper, and you had 4 nut peelers. And again, you could have this with ivory handles, or you could have this with xylonite. One of the things about James Dixon that's probably easiest to collect are actually spoons. And James Dixon made lots of nice fancy spoons. Top row there, we've got the sugar sifters, which are, well, are quite common, but obviously, again, something that's gone out of usage. Very, very popular when I have a cutlery stall. People always want to buy sugar sifters, and they're lovely items to handle, and they've all got different patterns. In the middle there, it's interesting, we've got bonbon helpers. This notion that very often in Victorian times, you didn't want to touch the food, or you didn't want to touch food that other people had touched. So you probably wanted a spoon or a pair of tongs or something that you could actually pick the bonbons up with. And then also across the bottom, we've got some jam spoons and other various condiment spoons. But again, James Dixon made lots and lots of very nice spoons, and you had lots of choice. Well, just I suppose a bit back to the fortunes for the company. Like many other Sheffield companies, the war absolutely wrecked the market for luxury goods. This is the First World War, and demand never recovered. Dixons became a limited company in 1920, and they had a share capital of £200,000. The chairman was Lennox Burton Dixon, so still a Dixon. I guess, you know, these companies were starting to struggle, and they were looking for ways to expand, survive. And one of the things that Dixons did, they absorbed the assets of William Hutton. Now, William Hutton was another big maker, but the the merger, the takeover wasn't a great success, partly because the main movers and shakers in the William Huntley Company didn't want to relinquish, if you like, their brand and the quality of their product. So they were almost still selling things in competition with James Dixon. The company survived into the 50s. In the Second World War, I'm sure James Dixon would have been involved in the war effort. You know, they would have been making things for the war and probably had some sort of secure business then. You know, and again, just thinking that every serviceman would have had a, you know, they would have had they might have had a flask, they would have had a knife and fork and a whole load of other things. So some of them would have been made by Sheffield Cutlery Companies. And certainly there would have been some making of armaments, particularly the shell cases for bullets and things might have been made by some of these companies. They survived in the 50s. There was, you know, they still had the large cutlery factory. And bizarrely, after 1947, they started making powder flasks again. We mentioned that earlier. And it was because all those American service people that were still being based here after the war, they wanted to take home a powder flask as a memento of their stay in Britain. 1960s, it was that sort of battle with competition of stainless and chromium plate, still managed by a Dixon. So there was another Dixon here. There was Milo Dixon, and he was the sort of 5th generation of the Dixon family. I did a little sort of fag packet calculation somewhere, and the Dixon family did get quite rich on the assets of the company. I think I estimated that over the life of the Dixons company, they'd taken something like, they'd taken £21 million out of the company in terms of money that they left to their ancestors. So they generally did very well out of it, but at this stage, it's interesting, a lot of the information about the wills comes from Tweedale, and he didn't mention Milo Dixon, and it may be, as the company was struggling, then there wasn't much left there. On Milo's death in 1976, Dixons went into receivership. There was an attempt at a revival by a chap called Bill Benson and 150 former employees. But again, the company collapsed in 1982 with debts of £1 million. Cornish Place was closed in 1992. Dixon's name was brought by British Silverware, and the operations were transferred to Windsor Street in Attercliffe. Lots of the moulds and the dies that were used by Dixons were held by British Silverware. Sadly, quite a lot of those were damaged in the Sheffield flood in 2007. So Jackie Tier is the director of British Silverware, and actually she's on the board of the Hawley Trust. And it would be an interesting question. See, it probably is still possible to buy some things branded with James Dixon on them, but they're probably high-end products, but maybe that's something that we'd need to explore. The Cornish Works lives on. So many of the Sheffield Cutlery companies have disappeared. You know, there it is, Ball Street Bridge. And if you want a 2-bedroom flat, I had a look before this talk, and for £215,000, you can buy a 2-bedroom flat in the Cornish Works. It is quite interesting now, people who live in the Cornish Works, some of them are becoming avid collectors of all things to do with James Dixon. And that's something that's nice to have. Just a couple of acknowledgements here. So quite a lot of the information for this talk I've taken from Geoffrey Tweedale's book. On the right there, you can see there is a book that's been written about the story of James Dixon. It's quite a novel format, the book, because it's a sort of A to Z of James Dixon. So you work through in that order. And it would be remiss of me not to mention the object on the front, which you might argue looks like a slightly over-the-top trophy. And it is an over-the-top trophy. It's the Blue Ribbon Trophy. That's the trophy for the fastest crossing of the Atlantic. So that was made by James Dixon. Another trophy that James Dixon made was the Masters Golf Trophy in America. So certainly, you know, we had a number of Sheffield companies that were making very prominent items of silverware as prizes, and certainly we talked about Walker and Hall in the last talk. Well, certainly James Dixon were involved in some of those things before. So it's interesting, right to the end, James Dixon's was run by members of the Dixon family. So I think to some extent that's a bit unique. Sorry, I'm just going back one. And there's quite a lot of mention in there of individual workers, some of the sort of the people who related to the family. There's certainly some pictures there of some of the workers involved in some of the processes, and also a bit of a reflection of there was a bit of there's a lot of deference, I think, from the workers to the owners. Probably quite a good relationship, and sometimes you had big gatherings to celebrate big birthdays or centenaries of some of the owners, and sometimes the workers would have a whip round and actually buy something for the manufacturer. If you've not been to one of these talks before, just a plug for our ongoing project, which is coming to its end now. It's going to finish in October, but this whole journey started off by us trying to work out how many knives we had with different surnames on. We're probably pushing 1,000 now, actually, 1,000 different companies. But, you know, and if you've got some memorabilia about the Sheffield cutlery industry, not necessarily anything of great value, but, you know, something that you don't know what to do with, your kids don't want it, you don't want to throw it out, well, certainly it would be of interest to us. You can have a look, if you do Facebook, you can have a look at the name on the knife blade group. You can email us at the Hawley Tool Collection. You can also have a look and see if your name is on a knife blade if you go to hawleysheffieldknives.com. And certainly on the 4th of July, we, a bit belatedly because of COVID, but we're actually launching the digital tool where we'll have 2 display screens in the gallery down at Kelham Island, where people can access and they can enter their surnames to have a look and see if your name is on a knife blade. But you can do this on any computer, and actually you can do this on your phone. I'm going to finish there. There may be some questions or just some comments or observations. Very happy to take them. We will be doing more talks on other cutlers and on other aspects of it. I certainly feel that one of these days I'm going to have to do a talk about big houses and cutlery companies, because as I explore a few different cutlery companies, it's interesting to sort of work back and have a look at where they live.